again, see, that is very high-level warfare.
Right.
What Israel did was it takes pictures. It's got 24/7 surveillance of where those things are launched from. And what it does is it's developed extremely low-yield, very precise munitions. So, if you look at Gaza flats, they're about 20, 30 stories high. It's an extremely high-density area. It can literally come down 17, 20 stories. And if you're on the second floor, it will still fly through your window and hit exactly the room that you're in. And this is entirely an intelligence-driven operation with very, very precise strikes. But remember, this doesn't apply to us in terms of the internal security.
Hello and welcome to PGurus channel. I'm your host Sri Iyer. Today, Abhijit Iyer-Mitra joins me to talk about a topic that we have not discussed before. Abhijit, welcome to PGurus channel.
Har Har Mahadev.
So Abhijit, you have been a student of many countries. You've traveled far and wide, and you said that in another conversation that you have learned about how various countries deal with various things. One of the things that we touched upon, or I'd like to touch upon today, is how Israel achieved peace in the areas of Gaza and the West Bank. And this is something that has been happening over a period of time. It appears like now things are fairly stable, and there is a lesson to be learned from this, isn't it?
Especially given the wake of what we're seeing with the COVID riots and with the Delhi riots. I think there's a lot to be learned from it. The first thing is, remember, Israel has a very, very solid judiciary. Almost ever since they came into existence, Israel has been under a state of emergency. And yet the average Israeli enjoys more civil rights and more personal freedoms than the average Indian does, even though we're not under a state of emergency, right? So the first building block of this has been a rock-solid judiciary that is very capable of understanding both the necessities of the state and justifying state action at times, but also being absolutely ruthless and brutal with the state in cutting the state down when civil rights of Israelis are violated. If you notice in India, as a rule, every time push comes to shove, initially till, especially till the First Amendment came in, that is how the Indian judiciary was. People of extraordinarily high caliber who had no issues in striking down government diktats that were highly capricious. So the judiciary performed absolute sterling service till the First Amendment came in. And from the First Amendment onwards, we've seen a gradual erosion of that. To the extent these days that the default setting is that the Supreme Court does not protect citizens from the government. It in fact exists to protect the government from the citizens. That is the default these days, number one. But that being the building block, let's look at how the other two things work. How the political leadership and how the forces, both the internal security forces and the armed forces, look at population control in a sense. Now, to be clear, that is an occupied population. This isn't an occupied population, but a lot of the lessons we learned in Kashmir, which considers itself, Kashmiri Muslims who consider themselves to be an occupied population, look at this. So number one, you have to be rock solid. The first and most important duty is the morale and ethos of your troops. If you keep scapegoating, throwing them in jail or bringing them up for judicial hearings based on the fact that there is no clear standard and operating procedures, based simply on public outrage, like Omar Abdullah has done to several troops on several occasions, jailing policemen, jailing CRPF and whatnot, you lose the confidence of your military or your internal security forces, and they lose the ability to operate in the cleanest possible way, number one. Number two, remember, as a rule, psychopaths and criminals tend to gravitate professionally towards militaries and police. Do you remember that serial on serial killers called Dexter? A
Yes.
famous American serial?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
That is actually, a lot of studies actually show that is true. So what you do, you have the possibility for extreme abuse when you give militaries unfettered control, as in you just give guideline principles and then tell them to go in. Because remember, even standard operating procedures can be violated if you know how to manipulate them. So what do? You then put things like body cameras on them, which acts as a natural check and balance on their actions. That they themselves know that, you can't manipulate the standard operating procedures. There has to be a clear threshold and things like that. Now, here, in spite of all the things that we've gone through, we still don't do it. And what you have is you have these American studies peddled around, which show costs of up to $300 billion for video camming the police force. Remember, that's absolute rubbish. When are you going to video cam people? It's only when they're going out on patrol, when they're dealing with an issue. And then if the policeman reports or somebody else reports there was an issue, then that data will be stored. Otherwise, the data is of no use. And after 30 days, you can wipe it. The same way that all our calls in India, all our WhatsApp messages in India have to, as per government law, be stored by the operator for 30 days. Now, nobody ever spoke about the data cost of that. So this is something that can eminently be done. And since we're champions of frugal innovation, so-called quote-unquote frugal innovation, this is also something that can be done and should be done. So one is enabling your police. Second, putting checks and balances on that police that are natural. They are not based on whims, fantasies, and political things. So these are the two main things. Now let's come to part two, which is how Israel dealt with the so-called third intifada. We all know what was the second intifada, which was huge, and that's what led to the Oslo peace process and all of that. The third intifada, have you heard about it?
No.
Nobody's heard about it. Why? Because it got aborted right from the beginning. What used to happen was, every time there was a suicide bombing in Israel, they would shut down all the border crossings for Palestinians who used to come work in Israel. And it used to be general collective punishment of the population. Now that no longer happens. What they do is, even at a border crossing, if these days it's knife attacks that are most common, because ever since that separation barrier, or what the Palestinians call the apartheid wall, went up, it's been impossible to carry out suicide bombings within Israel. But what happens is that the moment a knife stabbing happens at a border checkpoint, what happens is within 15 minutes, the border checkpoint is opened, and the COGAT, it's called, it's the Central Occupation Authority for the occupied areas, something like that, puts up a tweet showing the entire video sequence. Otherwise, they'll always say, ye masoom tha. Batla House, ye sab masoom the. Sonia Gandhi ji ne dekh ke rone lag gayi. Something like that Salman Khurshid said. Na? That will never happen in Israel, because you will always have video evidence that this person was guilty as hell and got killed for all the right reasons. And it'll be put up on the internet, on Twitter, by that COGAT's Twitter handle within 15 minutes. So there's another aspect to this. You have to game these things very, very carefully. See, you can't punish a whole population for the mistakes of one or two people. Because when you punish a whole population, then the entire population turns against you. That is the last thing you want. So you want to be very, very careful and pinpoint which is why this time you didn't see the kind of uprisings you saw during the second intifada. So again, what is happening here in, say, the Tablighi Jamaat? It was 2,000 people basically using Nizamuddin as a shield to protect themselves against any kind of police action. Now you start applying the same principles out here, you automatically get results. You know, that there's just far too much out here which we're not learning from the rest of the world, because the standard answer is, you know, I on your program several times before I've said, you know, the worst thing about Indian intellectuals is they cut and paste these social realities of the West onto India where it doesn't suit. Unfortunately, what happens in this country is that when there are in fact cut and paste models that can be modified to Indian conditions, they simply say Indian conditions are different. We don't need these Western examples. Why? Because it goes against their own entrenched interests, whatever money they're making from extortion and so on and so forth, right? So there's a whole uh, chain of best practices that we can adopt and in fact implement in India, which we're not doing at the moment.
Okay, so let's take a step back and look at how Israel controlled Gaza and West Bank. Now, you said that one of the things was that the knife attacks are being broadcast. Would that alone solve the problem for Israel? Because if you notice, I think 2 years ago or 3 years ago, what they would do, the Palestinians would do, is they would launch a missile at Israel from a civilian population area. And then when Israel comes for retribution, they would see that this was launched from a civilian area, and then they wouldn't know what to do about it. How did Israel get around this problem?
So again, see, I mean, that is very high level warfare.
Right.
What Israel did was it can now actually, it takes pictures. It's got 24/7 surveillance of where those things are launched from. And what it does is it's developed extremely low yield, very precise munitions. So, you know, if you look at Gaza flats, they're about 20, 30 stories high. It's an extremely high density area. It can literally come down 17, 20 stories. And if you're on the second floor, it will still fly through your window and hit exactly the room that you're in. And this is entirely an intelligence-driven operation with very, very precise strikes. But remember, this doesn't apply to us in terms of the internal security situations that we're looking at. So I'll get to the first part of your question, which was, you know, tweeting out the photo alone is not enough. Of course, it's not enough. There's lots of things, like I said, it's one in a cluster of solutions that you have to implement. So videography, enabling the police, controlling the police, training the police properly, and also busting the conspiracy theories and the fake victimhood that goes afterwards. Because what happens is fake victimhood, showing an innocent man getting killed or an innocent woman getting killed by the evil oppressor force, is one of the biggest recruitment tools around. So the moment you get rid of these fake victimhood narratives, that is a completely different part, but it all helps in the same effort.
Well, are they also trying to educate the population in Gaza and West Bank so that once you are educated, at least there's a certain amount of moderation also sets in, because people start thinking, right?
Not that we've seen in either the West Bank or Gaza, unfortunately. They have an extremely high level of education. You know, at one point of time, Gaza and the West Bank had the second highest per capita in the Arab world. Under Israeli occupation, incidentally. Now they're absolute rock bottom. That's a different matter. But at one point of time, they were way ahead of everybody else, and it didn't produce any kind of better thinking. Because remember, an occupied population will fundamentally act in different ways. This keeps coming back. And again, here we now have to separate Kashmir from the Delhi riots. Delhi riots have a slightly different way of dealing with them, which is a policing solution. Kashmir has a different way of dealing with it, which is a law and order solution. So two different paradigms.
Okay. Let's see. Now, whatever we just discussed, you know, whatever Israel has done in Israel and West Bank and Gaza, you will have to take that and apply it for India. You cannot verbatim do it, because I remember in the Delhi riots, there were some areas where the drones were surveilling, and when the drone surveillance was on, the riots actually stopped. And then when the drones got taken down, again, this problem started, right? So they were moving in the right direction, isn't it?
They were, but why wasn't it consistent? So, you know, the one thing that Israel always tells you is that the moment a congregation of 10 people happens, your game is lost right there. There are non-lethal ways of preventing a situation escalation if you catch it before 10 people congregate. Now, the thing was, the moment drones were used, people knew they would get caught, which is why those crowds were dissipating. Why weren't the drones then used during the Seelampur riots? Right, when it actually burst into full-on riots, why weren't they used? I mean, Seelampur is what exploded even initially. In December, when the Jamia Millia thing happened, It was the same Selampur that exploded into riots that were, and then it became a sort of quote unquote liberated zone kind of thing, right? So why do we see that one person thinks, what is this difference in approach? At one point, you think you will use drones, and then the next time you don't use drones. See, there's also an inconsistency in approach in dealing with these, right? So, main thing, if you are ahead in the intelligence game, you manage to get ahead and prevent the congregation from happening in the first place, then you automatically prevent 99% of riots from taking place. The problem here, like I said in the very first part of this, is with the police. We are a post facto police, not a preventative or preemptive police. So we will always go in after things have happened, after a crowd is collected. Therein lies our problem. It is also our approach to policing. Now, coming back to what you said, yeah, we can't take things verbatim. One of the things we have to do is, unfortunately in India, if you actually attend a police conference or something like that, you'll see nobody ever admits that anything went wrong. They'll all be congratulating themselves, and this happens in defense also. They'll keep congratulating themselves and say, yeah, everything, yeah, shabash, the way you dealt with 100 people would have died, and he'll still say, shabash, yaar, kya kamal karke dikha diya tumne. In Israel, even when they do everything right, you see their debriefings happen. They are so vicious with each other. They'll be friends. They'll go out friends and go out for a drink later, but they will slaughter. It's almost like committing harakiri. The other fellow will be putting a knife through his friend's ribs, twisting it around, and then, slitting his tummy open, kind of verbal laceration that they'll do to each other, because they are very, very keen that every time a failure is an opportunity to learn. Here, unfortunately, the way our system works is a failure is the end of your career. You can't do that unless you're willing to accept failure, a high cost of failure. How are you going to learn? Look, I want to reiterate this point about accepting failure. In this country, we're so scared of failure. When somebody points out a mistake I made, I'm actually quite happy to learn. Except when alt news points it out, that's a different matter because they're scumbags. But, when there's a genuine pointing out of mistakes I've made, I'm thrilled because, it's because of people that have pointed out my mistakes that I've been able to learn. Whereas in India, what happens is either you have a whole load of useless advice given to you, claiming to point out your mistakes, which isn't actually advice at all, because, we have a lot of hot air balloons. Or on the other hand, it is just chest thumping and backslapping. There's no actual dissection done of failures. Everything here is a success. Nobody wants to talk about failure. When something, happens purely through the grace of God, you get past something out of sheer dumb luck. What happens after that? No introspection to date. After what happened at Balakot, Balakot, we were very clear things got struck. But there was an initial failure in the sense that we failed to get see, it isn't just enough that you kill terrorists. Pakistan can accept a lot of terrorists being killed. It only takes them 2-3 years to train up more terrorists and then send them across the border. The issue is the visibility of defeat, that loss of face in front of your own population, that you were unable to defend your territory, which is why the video feed was so important. To date, we have not learned any lessons from it. I can tell you honestly, we have not even fixed the problem with the initial bunch of 6 Mirages that had to go in using the camera equipped things. We haven't fixed our satellite surveillance capability. There's not even any talk of it. Ho gaya. Now we move on. We muddle along to the next thing. As a rule, we are so scared, and it's a societal problem because failure, what happens to you if you fail in your maths exam? I don't know about your mother, because if I failed in my maths exam or any kind of exam, if there was anything close to not distinction, I used to get walloped badly, left, right, and center. So, this fear of failure, it discourages learning. It is psychologically, it is traumatic to a society where you discourage failure. You learn from failure. Failure is a good thing. But, when failure is stigmatized, starting from when you're a child, the effects are very, very, very bad.
It's true. So what I'm understanding from what you're saying is a policeman would rather be blamed for inaction than wrong action.
Exactly. Optimally, he'd like to be blamed for nothing. He does not want to rock the boat.
Well, see,
And yet you can't.
that's what we saw play out in all these incidents in Delhi riots, right? In
Absolutely.
many cases, they just didn't do anything until the pressure was so much that they had to do something.
Right. So if you saw that, these migrant workers who were going home after this ham-handed announcement of lockdown, I mean, ask yourself what kind of policy maker gives 3 days notice for a 1-day lockdown to go bang plates and glasses on your rooftop, but then gives you 4 hours notice for a 21-day lockdown. I mean, that in itself should tell you about the policy dysfunction in this country. But then, I appreciate the fact that police beating up these migrants they were suspended. But let's not stop at blaming the individual action. Were they given any training? Were they given proper instructions? What were they told to do? Ultimately, if somebody had reported this saying, oh, police in action, all these people were allowed to go, he would have lost his job. If he beats up and tries to control it also, he loses his job. Look at it from the policeman's point of view also. He is also stuck in a dilemma, so he doesn't know what to do. If he moves left, he loses his job. If he moves right, he loses his job. It is a systematic command and control problem, starting right from the top at the PM, starting with the PM himself, through the PMO, down to the police high command. There is something very, very serious wrong with the decision making in this country. And, now when, everything is on war footing, all hands on deck, you have a golden opportunity to set a lot of these things right. Unfortunately, because everybody is convinced they are absolutely right, and who's this bald fellow telling us what to do, they will do nothing.
Well, an almost bald fellow interviewing a bald fellow for pearls of wisdom, sometimes you never know, it might even go home. But it's always a good feeling to not just point the problems, but also point the solutions. And I think that's what we've accomplished in this video. Thank you very much, Abhijit. And we'll be back with more such interesting, in-depth conversations.
Har Har Mahadev.